The women's suffrage movement began in 1848 when a women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. For the following 50 years, supporters worked hard to educate the public about the validity of women's suffrage. Suffragists would circulate petitions and lobby Congress to pass a constitutional amendment for women. Especially during the Civil War, when men went to fight and women formed and ran shops, they realized they could do everything men were capable of. Their influence in church also made women hungry for more say and influence. The women's suffrage movement followed the women's empowerment movement, where women began to educate themselves and to go to college. Abolition also forced women to question why they could not vote. A few important people that led the women's suffrage movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They were both activists and in 1869 founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, one of the leading movements during the time. They hoped that gaining the right to vote for women would gain them other rights, such as equal pay, equal job opportunities, and legal equality. Another important activist for women in the 20th century was Dorothy Day. She was arrested several times for protecting to secure the right to vote for women.
There were two specific movements that led to the women's suffrage movement. The first movement was the club movement, which was basically women advocating on behalf of other women to be able to go to college and be able to take part in community service. The second movement that inspired the women's suffrage movement was the settlement house movement, which basically consisted of several women advocating for reform legislation on providing housing in poor urban areas. Politicians wouldn't listen to them because of their position and status within society. So women realized in order to be able to make true impact and change on society, they needed to gain the right to vote. In 1920, due to the combined efforts of the NAWSA and the NWP, the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to be able to vote in elections, was finally ratified. This victory is considered the most significant achievement of women in the progressive era. It was the single largest extension of democratic voting rights in our nation's history, and it was achieved peacefully through democratic processes.
A failing in the movement is that it could have been more inclusive along racial lines. As ahead of its time as the movement was, it still suffered from a racial bias towards minorities. Most of the members of the movement were middle-class white women. Sojourner Truth was the only black woman to be a part of the Susquehanna Falls Conference of 1848, talking on how black women were often excluded from our understanding of womanhood. The American Women's Suffrage Association wrote an open letter to the Southern legislators called What the South Can Do, and it was stated that with the help of white women, the political dominance of whites would remain secure. The significance of the women's suffrage movement is that after a 100-year battle, women in the U.S. finally got the right to vote. On August 19, 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed and it became legal for all U.S. women to vote. This movement was a big step forward for gender equality. One big fault in the Constitution is that it didn't make women equal to men. This is a big step forward with only more good to come.